Blood on the Rails, the Saga of the Canadian Pacific. A Bad Audiobooks YouTube channel production. Subscribe now. Be disappointed later. Chapter 1. The Weight of Iron. Dreams. The mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the bruised sky, their peaks crowned with snow that would never melt, their flanks scarred with the green wounds of pine and spruce. John McAllister stood at the edge of the surveyed route, his boots sinking into mud that had frozen and thawed a dozen times since spring's reluctant arrival. Behind him, the temporary camp sprawled across a clearing hacked from the wilderness, canvas tents sagging under morning dew, cook fires sending thin columns of smoke into air so crisp it hurt to breathe. He pulled his coat tighter, though the cold wasn't what made him shiver. In his hand, he clutched the telegram that had arrived 3 days prior, its words already committed to memory. Appointed Chief Engineer. Stop, kicking, horse, pass, section. Stop, report, immediately, stop. Van Horn. William Cornelius Van Horn. The name alone carried the weight of empire, of steel and steam, and the inexorable march of what men called progress. John had met him once in Montreal, in an office that smelled of cigars and ambition. Van Horn had looked at him with eyes that calculated the tensile strength of a man's soul as easily as the load-bearing capacity of a bridge. "You're Scottish," Van Horn had said, not as a question, but as an assessment. "Good. Your people know something about hard ground and harder choices." John had said nothing then. What could he say? That his people also knew about loss, about watching the land swallow those you loved, about the particular silence that follows a cave-in or a fall? His father had died building a railway bridge across the Firth of Forth. His younger brother, Thomas, had followed him into engineering and into an early grave, crushed between 2 coupling cars on a siding outside Glasgow. The McAllister men, it seemed, were destined to feed their bones to the appetite of iron and steam. "Mr. McAllister, sir?" John turned to find a young man approaching, barely 20, with the soft hands of a clerk and eyes that hadn't yet learned to hide their fear. Timothy Brennan, his assistant engineer, fresh from a technical college in Toronto where they taught theory, but not the reality of mud and blood. "The survey crews returned from the eastern approach," Timothy said, his breath forming small clouds. "They say the grade's worse than we thought, 30 degrees in places. We'll need to blast through solid granite for at least 2 miles. John nodded slowly, his mind already calculating. Dynamite? Timber for supports. Men. Dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, willing to dangle from ropes over chasms that dropped away into nothing, willing to drill holes into rock faces while the mountain groaned and shifted around them. "And the men?" John asked. "How many have we got?" Timothy consulted a ledger he'd pulled from his coat. 243 as of this morning, mostly Chinese laborers from the coast, about 60 Irish and Scots, a dozen Swedes. Thompson's been hiring anyone who can hold a pickaxe. Thompson. Silas Thompson, the foreman Van Horn had assigned to the project. John had met him yesterday, a bull of a man with a face like weathered granite and eyes that held all the warmth of a January wind. He'd looked at John's plans and drawings with barely concealed contempt. "Pretty pictures," Thompson had said, tapping the blueprints with a thick finger. "But pictures don't move rock, McAllister. Men do. And men need to be driven hard, or they'll slack off and we'll still be here when the snow flies." John had bitten back his response. He'd worked with men like Thompson before, men who saw laborers as interchangeable parts, as expendable as the timber they used for scaffolding. But Van Horn had made it clear. Thompson stayed. He had connections, political weight, and the kind of ruthlessness that got railways built on schedule. "Tell the survey crew I want to see their reports by noon," John said to Timothy, "and find out when the next supply train is due. We'll need more dynamite than we ordered." Timothy nodded and hurried off, leaving John alone with the mountains and his thoughts. He pulled a flask from his pocket, whiskey, the cheap kind that burned going down, and took a long swallow. The liquor did nothing to warm him, but it dulled the edge of memory, pushed back the images that came unbidden in quiet moments. Thomas's crushed body, his mother's face at the funeral, the sound of dirt hitting a coffin lid. "Ye look like a man carrying the weight of the world, and that's a fact." John turned to find an older man approaching, his gait rolling like a sailor's. His face seamed with lines that spoke of decades under an unforgiving sun. He wore the rough clothes of a laborer, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he'd once held authority. "Patrick O'Reilly," the man said, extending a calloused hand. "Late of County Cork, by way of Boston, Chicago, and half a dozen railway camps between here and hell." John shook his hand, feeling the strength in the old man's grip. "John McAllister, chief engineer, apparently." "Aye, I heard. Van Horn's man." Patrick pulled out a pipe and began packing it with tobacco. "I've worked on railways from the Atlantic to the Pacific, Mr. McAllister. Seen good men and bad, good engineers and fools. The question is, which are you?" John felt a flicker of irritation. "I suppose you'll find out." Patrick lit his pipe, the smoke adding to the morning's haze. "I suppose I will. But I'll tell you this for free. These mountains don't care about your blueprints or your schedules. They'll take what they want, when they want it. Men's lives, mostly. The trick is to give them as few as possible." "I don't intend to give them any." "Aye, well, intentions are fine things." Patrick's eyes, sharp despite his age, studied John's face. "But this railway, it's already got blood on it. Chinese workers dying by the dozen on the Fraser Canyon route. Cave-ins, explosions, falls. Some say the line from Port Moody to here is built on bones." John had heard the stories. Everyone had. The Chinese workers, brought over by the thousands, paid a fraction of what white laborers earned, given the most dangerous jobs, dying in numbers that the Canadian Pacific Railway Company recorded with the same dispassion they used for listing broken equipment. "I've got a daughter," Patrick said suddenly. "Mae. She's coming up from the coast, should be here within the week. Smart as a whip, that girl. Reads and writes better than most men. She'll be working in the camp." John raised an eyebrow. "Working? Doing what?" "Whatever needs doing. Cooking, mending, keeping accounts. Mae's got a head for numbers." Patrick's voice carried a note of challenge. "I know what you're thinking. A railway camp's no place for a woman. But Mae's tougher than half the men here, and she's got nowhere else to go. Her mother died last winter, and I'll not leave her alone in some coastal town." John thought of the camp, of the rough men and rougher conditions, of the violence that simmered just beneath the surface of any place where desperate men gathered. But he also thought of his own mother, widowed young, who'd raised 3 sons by taking in washing and mending, who'd worked her fingers raw so they could eat. "If she can do the work, I've no objection," John said finally. But Thompson might feel differently. "Thompson can go to hell," Patrick said mildly. "With all due respect to your authority, Mr. McAllister, I don't answer to that bastard. I answer to you, and if you say Mae can work, then she works." John found himself almost smiling. "Fair enough. But keep her away from the blasting sites, and tell her to stay clear of the Chinese camp. There's tension." "Aye, I've noticed." Patrick drew on his pipe. "Thompson's been stirring it up, from what I hear, telling the white workers that the Chinese are taking their jobs, driving down wages, never mind that the Chinese are doing work most white men won't touch." It was true. John had seen it in every camp he'd worked. The casual cruelty, the scapegoating, the way fear and resentment could be weaponized by men like Thompson. Divide the workers, keep them fighting each other, and they'd never unite against the real enemy. The conditions that killed them, the wages that barely kept them alive, the company that saw them as nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. "I should get to work," John said, though he made no move to leave. The mountains held him, their immensity a reminder of his own insignificance. Somewhere up there, in those peaks and passes, lay the route they would carve. Somewhere up there, men would die. The only question was how many, and whether their deaths would mean anything beyond another mile of track laid, another section completed, another line drawn on Van Horn's maps. "One more thing," Patrick said. "There's a Chinese worker, name of Lao. He speaks English, acts as a translator for his crew. Smart man, educated. You might want to talk to him, get his measure. The Chinese workers, they're the backbone of this operation, whether Thompson likes it or not. John nodded. I'll find him. Patrick tipped his cap and walked away, leaving John alone once more. The sun had risen higher now, burning through the morning mist, revealing the full scope of the work ahead. The mountains stretched endlessly, ridge after ridge, each one a challenge, each one a potential grave. John thought of his brother Thomas, of the last time he'd seen him alive. They'd been working on the same project, a bridge across a Scottish valley. Thomas had been laughing about something, John couldn't remember what, his face bright with youth and confidence. 2 hours later, he was dead, and John was left with nothing but guilt and the terrible knowledge that he'd been the senior engineer, that he should have checked the coupling, should have seen the danger. He'd sworn then that he'd never let it happen again, that he'd protect his workers, that he'd put their safety above schedules and profits and the demands of men like Van Horn. But standing here, looking at the impossible task ahead, he wondered if such promises were nothing more than comfortable lies we tell ourselves to sleep at night. The camp was stirring now, men emerging from tents, the smell of coffee and frying bacon drifting on the wind. John could hear voices, English, Gaelic, Cantonese, Swedish, a babel of tongues united by the common language of labor and survival. Somewhere, a hammer rang against steel. Somewhere else, a man coughed, the deep, wet sound of lungs damaged by rock dust and cold. This was his kingdom now. These men, this mountain, this impossible dream of iron rails stretching from sea to sea. John McAllister, chief engineer, appointed by Van Horn to do what many said couldn't be done, punch a railway through the Kicking Horse Pass, through mountains that had stood since the world was young, through terrain that had defeated better men than him. He took another drink from his flask, then stoppered it and put it away. There would be time for whiskey later, when the day's work was done and the ghosts came calling. For now, there were plans to review, men to organize, a mountain to conquer. John walked back toward the camp, his boots squelching in the mud, his mind already racing through calculations and contingencies. Behind him, the mountains watched in silence, patient as stone, waiting to see what these small, determined creatures would do, waiting to see how many of them would die trying to leave their mark on the eternal face of the world. Chapter 2. Labor of Love. Mae O'Reilly arrived on a supply wagon 6 days later, sitting atop crates of dynamite as if they were nothing more dangerous than sacks of flour. John saw her from a distance, a small figure in a man's coat and trousers, her red hair bound up under a cap, her face set with the kind of determination he'd seen in soldiers before a battle. Patrick met the wagon, and John watched as father and daughter embraced. Even from 50 yards away, he could see the relief in the old man's face, the way his shoulders relaxed as if he'd been holding his breath for a week. Mae pulled back, said something that made Patrick laugh, then jumped down from the wagon with an agility that suggested she'd spent more time on work sites than in parlors. John returned to his tent, where he'd spread out the survey reports and was trying to make sense of the terrain ahead. The eastern approach was worse than he'd feared. Not just steep, but unstable, with layers of shale that would shift and slide at the slightest disturbance. They'd need to build retaining walls, blast carefully to avoid triggering larger slides, and probably lose at least a month to the work. "Mr. McAllister?" He looked up to find Mae O'Reilly standing at the tent's entrance, her cap in her hands, her hair catching the afternoon light. Up close, she was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 25, with her father's sharp eyes and a jaw that suggested she didn't back down easily. "Miss O'Reilly," John said, standing. "Your father said you'd be arriving." "Aye, and here I am." Her accent was softer than Patrick's, touched by years in America. "I wanted to introduce myself proper-like, and to ask what work you'd have for me." John gestured to the camp outside. "Can you cook?" "I can. Can you?" He blinked, surprised by the directness. Yes, actually. Field rations, mostly." "Then you know it's skilled work, not just women's work." Mae stepped into the tent uninvited, her eyes scanning the maps and reports. but I'm better with numbers than with pots. My Da says you need someone to keep accounts, track supplies, make sure the company's not cheating the workers on their pay. The company doesn't, John began, then stopped. Of course the company cheated the workers. Every company did. Short waits on supplies, creative accounting on hours worked, deductions for tools and lodging that somehow always left men with less than they'd earned. Mae smiled, but there was no humor in it. My Da's worked railways for 30 years, Mr. McAllister. I've been keeping his account since I was 12. I know every trick the companies use, and I know how to catch them at it. John studied her, the small woman with fire in her eyes and mud on her boots. If I give you access to the accounts, Thompson will object. He handles the payroll. Aye, I'm sure he does, and I'm sure he's skimming off the top, same as every foreman I've ever met. Mae's voice was matter-of-fact, without accusation. I'm not asking to replace him, just to audit the books, make sure the numbers add up, unless you'd rather not know where the money's going. It was a challenge, and they both knew it. John could refuse, could tell her to stick to cooking and mending, could avoid the confrontation with Thompson that would inevitably follow, or he could do what he'd sworn to do, protect his workers, even from the men who were supposed to be on their side. All right, John said, you can audit the accounts, but you report to me, not to your father and not to anyone else, and if Thompson gives you trouble, you come to me immediately. Mae's smile was genuine this time. Thank you, Mr. McAllister. You'll not regret it. I already regret it, John said, but he was almost smiling too. Thompson's going to be furious. Let him be furious. Fury never hurt anyone. Mae turned to leave, then paused. My Da says you're a good man. Says you care about the workers, not just the railway. That's rare in my experience. Your experience being? 30 years of watching my father break his back for men who wouldn't piss on him if he was on fire. Mae's voice was hard now, edged with old anger. Watching him come home with injuries that should have killed him, watching him get paid half what he was owed, watching him get older and slower while the companies got richer and richer. So Mr. McAllister, I've got experience, and I've got no patience for men who treat workers like they're disposable. She left before John could respond, her footsteps quick and light on the muddy ground. John sat back down, staring at the maps without seeing them. He'd just made an enemy of Thompson, and the work hadn't even properly begun. But Mae was right. The workers deserved better than to be cheated by the very men who were supposed to pay them. That evening, John made his way to the Chinese section of the camp. It was separate from the main area, a collection of smaller tents arranged in neat rows with a cook fire that smelled of unfamiliar spices. The Chinese workers kept to themselves mostly, speaking their own language, eating their own food, sleeping apart from the white laborers who viewed them with suspicion and resentment. John found Lau sitting outside one of the tents, writing in a small book by the light of a lantern. He was younger than John had expected, perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and hands that bore the calluses of hard labor, but moved with the precision of a scholar. "Mr. Lau," John said, "I'm John McAllister, the chief engineer. I was hoping we could talk." Lau looked up, his expression neutral. "Of course, Mr. McAllister. Please, sit." He gestured to a log that had been positioned near the fire. John sat, suddenly aware of the eyes watching from other tents, of the way conversation had stopped at his arrival. He was an intruder here, a representative of the company that paid Chinese workers $1 a day while white workers earned 3 times that for the same work. "Your English is excellent," John said. "Thank you. I studied in San Francisco before coming north." Lau's voice was soft, cultured. "I was a teacher there, in the Chinese Quarter, but the work dried up and I had debts to pay, so I came here to build your railway." "Our railway," John corrected. "You're building it as much as anyone." Lau smiled slightly. "Am I? I was under the impression that we Chinese are merely the hands that do the work, not the minds that plan it or the voices that speak for it." It was a gentle rebuke, but a rebuke nonetheless. John felt his face warm. "You're right. I apologize. The company's treatment of Chinese workers is—" "It's not right." "No, it is not." Lau closed his book carefully. But it is the way of things, is it not? In every country and every time there are those who are valued and those who are not. We Chinese, we are not valued. We are useful, but not valued. There is a difference. John thought of Mae's words, of her father's 30 years of being treated as disposable. I want to change that, at least on this section, on my watch. I want to make sure everyone is paid fairly, treated fairly, kept as safe as possible. A noble sentiment. Lau's tone was not mocking, but neither was it convinced. But you are one man, Mr. McAllister, and there are forces at work here larger than either of us. The company wants its railway built quickly and cheaply. The foreman, Mr. Thompson, he wants his profit and his power. The white workers, they want to believe they are superior to us, because if they are not superior, then they must face the truth that they are as disposable as we are. You're a philosopher, John said. I am a man who has learned to see clearly, because my life depends on it. Lau opened his book again, showing John pages covered in Chinese characters. I keep records, Mr. McAllister, of every man in our crew, of every injury, of every death. The company does not keep such records for us. When a Chinese worker dies, he is simply replaced, and it is as if he never existed. But I remember. I write their names, their stories. It is the least I can do. John felt something twist in his chest. How many have died since you started keeping records? On the Fraser Canyon section, where I worked before coming here, 43 men in 8 months. Falls, mostly. Explosions. One man was swept away by the river. Another was crushed when a tunnel collapsed. Lau's voice was steady, but his eyes held depths of sorrow. Here, we have been fortunate. Only 2 deaths so far, but we have only just begun. I'll do everything I can to keep that number from growing, John said. I believe you will try. Lau met his eyes. But the mountain does not care about your intentions, Mr. McAllister, and neither does the company. They will push for speed, for progress, and men will die. The only question is how many, and whether their deaths will be remembered. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. From the main camp, John could hear singing, an Irish ballad, voices rough but harmonious. From the Chinese camp, there was only quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from exhaustion and resignation. I'd like your help, John said finally. I need someone who can tell me the truth about conditions, about safety concerns, about what the workers need. Thompson won't tell me. He'll just say everything's fine until someone dies. But you see clearly, as you said. Will you help me? Lau considered this. If I help you, I make myself a target. Thompson already dislikes the Chinese. If he thinks I am undermining his authority, he will find ways to make life difficult for my crew. I'll protect you. Can you? Lau's question was not challenging, merely curious. You are the chief engineer, yes, but Thompson has been here longer. He has relationships, connections, and you are new, untested. If it comes to a choice between you and him, who do you think the company will support? John had no answer to that. Lau was right. He was new, and Van Horn had made it clear that Thompson was to remain as foreman. If John pushed too hard, too fast, he might find himself replaced, and then what good would his intentions do? I understand your hesitation, John said, but I'm asking anyway. Because if we don't try to change things, nothing will ever change, and more men will die than have to. Lau studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. I will help you, Mr. McAllister. But I ask one thing in return. Name it. When my men die, and they will die, despite your best efforts, I ask that you remember their names, that you write them down as I do, that you bear witness to their existence. Lau's voice was soft but intense. The company will forget them. History will forget them. But you can remember. Will you do that? John felt the weight of the request, the responsibility it carried. To remember was to acknowledge, to make real, to transform statistics into human beings with names and stories and people who mourned them. "I will," John said. "I promise." They shook hands, and John felt as if he'd just made a covenant more binding than any contract with the railway company. He'd promised to remember, and in remembering, to honor the dead. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the face of the vast machinery of progress and profit, but it was something. As John walked back to his tent, he passed the main camp's cook fire, where Mae O'Reilly was serving stew to a line of workers. She'd changed into a dress, still practical, still worn, but the men treated her with a rough courtesy that suggested Patrick had made his expectations clear. She caught John's eye and nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement between allies. In his tent, John lit a lantern and pulled out a fresh notebook. On the first page he wrote, "Workers who have died in the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, Kicking Horse Pass section." Below that, he left space for names, dates, circumstances. It was empty now, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way. He thought of Lau's records, of the 43 men who had died on the Fraser Canyon section, of the 2 who had already died here. He thought of his brother Thomas, of his father, of all the men who had fed their lives to the hunger of iron and steam, and he thought of Mae's words. Fury never hurt anyone. But she was wrong. Fury hurt everyone. It was the fuel that drove men like Thompson, the poison that turned workers against each other, the fire that consumed everything it touched. What was needed wasn't fury, but something harder to sustain: compassion, vigilance, the stubborn refusal to accept that some lives mattered less than others. John closed the notebook and extinguished the lantern. Outside, the camp was settling into sleep, the sounds of men and mountain blending into a symphony of exhaustion. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, they would start carving their way through the Kicking Horse Pass, and the mountain would begin to exact its price. He lay on his cot, staring into darkness, and wondered how many names he would have to write in that notebook before the railway was complete. And he wondered if, when it was all over, anyone would remember them but him. Chapter 3. The Weight of Mountains. The Chinese camp woke before dawn, as it always did. Lau rose from his bedroll and stepped out into air so cold it felt like breathing knives. Around him, his countrymen were already stirring, rolling up blankets, rekindling fires, preparing the rice and tea that would sustain them through another day of breaking rock and defying gravity. Lau had been in Canada for 2 years now, and he still wasn't used to the cold. In Guangdong province, where he'd been born, winter meant cool breezes and occasional rain. Here, winter meant death, slow and certain for anyone caught unprepared. Already, he'd seen men lose fingers and toes to frostbite, seen others sicken with pneumonia and die coughing blood into the snow. "Lao Xian Sheng," a voice called. Teacher Lao. It was Chen Wei, a young man from the same village as Lau's mother. He approached with a bowl of rice and a cup of tea. "You should eat." "Thank you, Wei." Lau accepted the bowl, though his stomach was tight with the anxiety that had become his constant companion. Today, they would begin work on the eastern approach, the section that John McAllister had identified as particularly dangerous. Lau had studied the survey reports. McAllister had shown them to him, treating him as an equal in a way that still surprised him, and he knew what they faced. Unstable shale, steep grades, the constant risk of rock slides. "The white foreman was here last night," Wei said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Thompson. He was drunk, shouting about how we Chinese are cowards, how we're not worth the rice we eat." Lau's jaw tightened. Thompson's hatred of the Chinese workers was no secret, but it had been getting worse lately. Last week he'd cut their rations, claiming the company was economizing. When Lau had protested, politely, carefully, Thompson had threatened to have him removed from the crew. "Did he hurt anyone?" Lau asked. "No. Old Feng stood up to him, told him to leave. Thompson backed down, but—" Wei's voice trailed off. They both knew what the "but" meant. Thompson would remember the insult, and he would find a way to punish them for it. Lau finished his rice and stood. "Tell the men to be extra careful today. Watch for loose rock, test every handhold. If something feels unsafe, stop work and find me or Mr. McAllister. Will McAllister listen? It was a fair question. In Wei's experience, in all their experience, white bosses didn't listen to Chinese workers. They gave orders and expected obedience. And if men died following those orders, well, there were always more Chinese willing to take their place. He will listen, Lao said, with more confidence than he felt. He is different. Different how? Because he smiles when he gives orders? Because he pretends to care? Wei's voice was bitter. I have seen different white men before, Lao Xiansheng. They are the same as all the others when it matters. Lao couldn't argue with that. He'd seen it too. The casual cruelty, the indifference to Chinese suffering, the way even well-meaning white men would ultimately choose their own kind over justice. But something in John McAllister's eyes, in the way he'd asked for help, in his promise to remember the dead, something made Lao want to believe. Perhaps you are right, Lao said, but we must try. What is the alternative? To accept that we are worthless, that our lives mean nothing? Wei looked away. Sometimes I think that would be easier, to stop hoping, to stop expecting anything better. Easier, yes, but we would lose ourselves. Lao placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder. We are not just bodies to break rock, Wei. We are men, with dignity and worth. We must remember that, even when others forget. The sun was rising now, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. It was beautiful, in a terrible way, the kind of beauty that reminded you how small you were, how insignificant in the face of geological time and natural power. Lao thought of the poems he'd studied as a young man, of the Tang Dynasty masters who had written about mountains and rivers, about the way nature dwarfed human ambition. But those poets had never tried to build a railway through the Rockies. They had never dangled from ropes over 1,000-foot drops, never drilled holes for dynamite while rock dust filled their lungs, never watched friends die because a company valued speed over safety. The work crew assembled as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. 40 Chinese workers, each carrying the tools of their trade, pickaxes, shovels, drills, hammers. They were small men, most of them, made smaller by malnutrition and exhaustion, but they were strong in the way that survivors are strong, with the resilience born of having nothing left to lose. John McAllister was waiting at the worksite, along with Thompson and a handful of white workers who would supervise the blasting. Lao saw the way Thompson looked at the Chinese crew with contempt barely concealed, and felt his stomach tighten further. "All right, listen up," Thompson bellowed. "We're starting on the eastern approach today. The Chinese will do the drilling and place the charges. White crew will handle the blasting and clear the debris. We're behind schedule, so I want this done fast. No slacking, no breaks unless I say so. Anyone who can't keep up can find work elsewhere." It was a threat, and everyone knew it. Elsewhere meant starvation, meant the long journey back to the coast with no money and no prospects, meant shame and failure. John stepped forward. "Before we start, I want to review the safety procedures. This is unstable ground, and we need to be careful." Thompson snorted. "Safety procedures. Christ, McAllister, we're building a railway, not a church. The Chinese know what to do. They've been doing it for months. And 43 of them died doing it on the Fraser Canyon section," John said quietly. "I'd like to avoid repeating that here." The Chinese workers stirred at that, surprised that McAllister knew the number, that he'd bothered to find out. Lao felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Wei was wrong. Maybe this white man was different. Thompson's face darkened. Those deaths were accidents. Unavoidable. You can't build a railway through mountains without losing some men. "Perhaps not, but we can minimize the losses." John turned to the crew. "I want everyone roped together when working on the cliff face. I want spotters watching for rock slides. And I want everyone to understand that if something feels unsafe, you stop work immediately and report it. No one will be punished for raising safety concerns." "That's not your call to make," Thompson said. "I'm the foreman. I decide when work stops and starts." "And I'm the chief engineer," John replied, his voice still quiet but with an edge of steel. "And I'm telling you that safety comes first. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with Van Horn." For a moment, Lau thought Thompson might actually strike McAllister. The foreman's hands clenched into fists, his face flushed with rage. But then he seemed to remember where he was, who was watching, and he forced a smile that looked more like a snarl. "Fine. We'll do it your way, McAllister. But when we fall behind schedule, when Van Horn starts asking why we're not making progress, I'll make sure he knows whose fault it is." Thompson stalked off, leaving John alone with the crew. The chief engineer looked tired, Lau thought. Tired and worried, as if he'd just realized the size of the burden he'd taken on. "All right," John said. "Let's get to work. Carefully." The crew moved to the cliff face, where the survey team had marked the route with stakes and flags. It was a sheer wall of rock, rising 200 feet above them, with a narrow ledge about halfway up where they would need to drill. Below the ledge, the ground dropped away into a ravine filled with broken stone and the skeletal remains of trees. Lau was assigned to the drilling crew, along with Wei and 4 others. They would be lowered on ropes to the ledge, where they would spend the day drilling holes for dynamite charges. It was dangerous work. One slip, one frayed rope, one moment of inattention, and you were dead. As they prepared the ropes and harnesses, Lau found himself thinking about his life before the railway. He'd been a teacher in San Francisco's Chinatown, instructing the children of immigrants in Chinese classics and English grammar. It had been a good life, modest but dignified. He'd had a small room, enough to eat, the respect of his community. Then the debts had come. His father, back in Guangdong, had borrowed money from a local merchant to buy land. When the harvest failed, the merchant had demanded payment, and when Lau's father couldn't pay, the merchant had threatened to take everything: the land, the house, even Lau's mother and sisters as servants. Lau had sent what money he could, but a teacher's salary wasn't enough, so he'd come north, to the railway camps, where the pay was better and the work was plentiful. He'd told himself it would be temporary, just a year or two until the debts were paid. But the debts never seemed to shrink, and the railway kept pushing deeper into the mountains, and now here he was, about to dangle from a rope over a ravine, drilling holes in rock so that white men could ride trains across a continent. "Ready?" Wei asked, checking Lau's harness. "Ready," Lau lied. They were lowered one by one, the ropes creaking under their weight, the rock face rough against their hands and knees. The ledge was narrower than it had looked from below, barely 3 feet wide with loose shale that shifted underfoot. Lau pressed his back against the cliff and tried not to look down. "Start drilling," came Thompson's voice from above, "and make it quick." They began to work, the sound of steel on stone echoing across the ravine. It was hard, monotonous labor. Position the drill, strike with the hammer, reposition, strike again. Lau's arms ached within minutes, his hands blistering despite the calluses. Beside him, Wei worked with grim determination, his face set in concentration. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, turning the ledge into an oven. Sweat ran into Lau's eyes, making it hard to see. His throat was parched, but they'd been given only 1 canteen of water to share among 6 men, and it was already empty. "How much longer?" Wei gasped. Lau examined the hole he was drilling. They needed to go at least 3 feet deep to place the charges properly. He was maybe halfway there. "Another hour, perhaps?" "I don't know if I can last another hour." "You can," Lau said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "We both can. We must." Above them, Thompson was shouting at someone, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. Lau couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable: anger, contempt, the voice of a man who enjoyed wielding power over others. Then, without warning, the ledge shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight movement under Lau's feet, like the deck of a ship in gentle swells. But then the shale began to slide, and suddenly the ledge was crumbling, and Lau was falling, his hands scrabbling for purchase on rock that came away in chunks. His rope caught him with a jerk that drove the air from his lungs. He swung against the cliff face, his shoulder striking rock, pain exploding through his body. Above him, he could hear shouting, could feel the rope jerking as whoever was holding it struggled to keep him from falling further. "Lau!" Wei's voice, high with panic. "Lau, are you all right?" Lau couldn't answer. He was spinning slowly, the ravine yawning below him, his vision graying at the edges. He'd lost his hammer in the fall, and he could hear it clattering down the cliff face, bouncing from rock to rock until the sound faded into silence. "Pull him up!" That was John McAllister's voice. "Carefully! Don't let the rope slip!" Slowly, agonizingly, Lau was hauled upward. His shoulders screamed with every movement, and he thought he might vomit from the pain and fear. But finally, hands were grabbing him, pulling him over the edge, laying him on solid ground. He lay there gasping, staring up at the sky, feeling the earth solid and unmoving beneath him. He was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive. "Are you hurt?" John was kneeling beside him, his face tight with concern. "Can you move?" Lau tested his limbs carefully. His shoulder was badly bruised, maybe dislocated, but nothing seemed broken. I think I am all right." "That's it for today," John said, standing. "Everyone off the cliff. We'll resume tomorrow after I've had a chance to reinforce the ledge." "The hell we will," Thompson said. He'd appeared from somewhere, his face red with anger. "We've got a schedule to keep, McAllister. One Chinaman taking a tumble doesn't mean we stop work." "That Chinaman nearly died because the ledge was unstable," John said, his voice cold. "And if we keep working, someone else will die. We stop now." "You're making a mistake," Thompson said. "Van Horn won't tolerate delays." "Then Van Horn can come up here and drill the holes himself." John turned to the crew. "Everyone back to camp. That's an order." The workers didn't need to be told twice. They gathered their tools and headed down the trail, leaving Thompson and John facing each other like two bulls about to charge. Lau, still lying on the ground, watched them with a strange detachment. His shoulder throbbed, his hands were bleeding, and he could still feel the sickening lurch of the ledge giving way beneath him. But he was alive, and John McAllister had stopped the work, had put safety above schedule. Maybe Way was wrong. Maybe this white man was different after all. Or maybe, Lau thought as darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, maybe he was just better at hiding what he really was. Time would tell. Time and the mountain, which cared nothing for the intentions of men, white or Chinese, good or evil. The mountain would take what it wanted, and all they could do was try to survive. Chapter 4. The Corruption of Iron Silas. Thompson sat in his tent, a bottle of whiskey at his elbow and a ledger spread before him. The numbers swam slightly. He'd been drinking since noon, but he could still make them out well enough. The payroll for the Chinese workers. 40 men at $1 per day, 7 days a week. That was $280 weekly, except Thompson was reporting 35 men to the company and pocketing the difference. $5 a day, 35 a week, 140 a month. Not a fortune, but enough to make the job worthwhile, and that was just one of his schemes. There were the supply contracts, where he bought cheap equipment and charged the company for quality goods. There were the kickbacks from merchants in the nearest town, who paid him to ensure their goods were purchased. There were the fines he levied on workers for imaginary infractions, the deductions for tools and lodging that went straight into his pocket. All told, Thompson was clearing an extra $300 a month on top of his foreman's salary. In a year, he'd have enough to buy land, maybe start a business, get out of this godforsaken wilderness and live like a gentleman. The only problem was John McAllister. Thompson took a long drink, feeling the whiskey burn down his throat. McAllister was going to ruin everything. The man was too honest, too concerned with the workers, too willing to question Thompson's authority. And now he'd brought in that Irish bitch to audit the books. Mae O'Reilly. Thompson had met her type before, women who thought they were as good as men, who didn't know their place. She'd been in camp for less than a week, and already she was asking questions, requesting receipts, comparing his reports to the actual supplies delivered. Thompson had tried to intimidate her, had cornered her by the supply tent and made it clear that women who caused trouble had a way of getting hurt. But she just looked at him with those cold green eyes and said, "Touch me, and my father will gut you like a fish, and if he doesn't, I will." He'd backed off, but only because Patrick O'Reilly was watching from across the camp, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. The old man was past his prime, but he was still dangerous, and he had friends among the Irish workers. Thompson couldn't afford to start a war with the Irish crew, not when he needed them to keep the Chinese in line. No, he'd have to be more subtle, find a way to discredit Mae, or better yet to get rid of McAllister entirely. If McAllister was gone, Thompson could install a more pliable engineer, someone who understood how things really worked, who wouldn't ask inconvenient questions about missing money or dead workers. There was a knock at the tent pole. "Come," Thompson called. A man entered, small and weasel-faced, with the shifty eyes of someone who'd spent his life looking for angles. Danny Reeves, one of Thompson's creatures, a man who'd do anything for money and ask no questions. "You wanted to see me, boss?" "Sit down, Danny." Thompson poured a second cup of whiskey and slid it across the table. "I've got a job for you." "What kind of job?" Danny's eyes gleamed with interest. "The kind that pays well and requires discretion." Thompson leaned back, studying the smaller man. "You know that ledge where the Chinese are drilling? The one that collapsed yesterday?" "Yeah, I heard about that. One of them nearly died." "Nearly?" Thompson smiled. "But what if next time someone did die? What if there was an accident, something that couldn't be blamed on anyone in particular, but that made it clear that McAllister's safety procedures aren't working?" Danny's eyes narrowed. "You want me to cause an accident? I want you to help nature take its course. That ledge is unstable. It wouldn't take much to make it more unstable. A little digging here, a little loosening there, and if someone happens to be standing on it when it gives way—" Thompson shrugged. "Well, that's the risk of building a railway through mountains. And what's in it for me?" $50, cash, no questions asked." Danny whistled softly. $50 is a lot of money. It's a lot of risk. If you're caught, I'll deny everything. You'll be on your own." "I won't get caught." Danny drained his whiskey and stood. "When do you want it done?" "Soon. Before McAllister reinforces the ledge. Tomorrow night, maybe. The Chinese don't post guards. They're too tired. You should be able to get in and out without being seen." "Consider it done, boss." Danny touched his cap and left, moving with the quick, furtive steps of a rat. Thompson poured himself another drink and returned to his ledger. It was a shame, really. He didn't have anything personal against the Chinese workers. They were hard workers, uncomplaining, willing to do jobs that white men wouldn't touch. But they were also expendable, and if one or two of them had to die to protect Thompson's interests, well, that was just the cost of doing business. The real target was McAllister. Once the engineer was discredited, once Van Horn saw that his precious safety procedures were causing delays and costing lives, Thompson would be back in control, and Mae O'Reilly would learn that some battles couldn't be won with ledgers and receipts. Thompson closed the ledger and locked it in his trunk. Outside, the camp was settling into evening, the sounds of men and mountain blending into a familiar symphony. Somewhere, someone was playing a fiddle, the notes bright and melancholy. Somewhere else, men were arguing in Cantonese, their voices rising and falling like water over stones. Thompson felt no guilt about what he'd set in motion. Guilt was for men who had the luxury of conscience, who didn't understand that the world was divided into those who took and those who were taken from. He'd been on the wrong side of that divide for too long, working for other men, taking orders, watching them get rich while he scraped by. Not anymore. This railway was his chance, maybe his last chance, to climb out of the mud and into something better. And he wasn't going to let John McAllister or anyone else stand in his way. Mae O'Reilly sat in her father's tent, the payroll ledgers spread before her, and felt her anger growing with each page she turned. The numbers didn't lie, and what they told her was that Silas Thompson was a thief. The discrepancies were everywhere once you knew to look for them. Workers who appeared on the payroll but didn't exist. Supplies that were charged at twice their actual cost. Deductions for equipment that was never provided. It was brazen, really, the kind of theft that assumed no one would ever check, that the workers were too ignorant or too intimidated to question their pay. "How bad is it?" Patrick asked. He was sitting on his cot, cleaning his pipe, but his eyes were sharp. "Bad. He's stealing at least $300 a month, maybe more." Mae tapped the ledger. "And that's just what I can prove. There are probably other schemes I haven't found yet." Patrick's jaw tightened. The bastard. And McAllister doesn't know? "I don't think so. Thompson handles all the financial reports, and McAllister's been focused on the engineering side." Mae closed the ledger. "But I need to tell him. The workers deserve to be paid what they're owed." "Aye, they do. But be careful, lass. Thompson's a dangerous man. He won't take kindly to being exposed." "I'm not afraid of him." "I know you're not. That's what worries me." Patrick set down his pipe and looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and fear. "You're like your mother, God rest her. Brave to the point of foolishness. But bravery doesn't stop bullets or knives, Mae. And Thompson's the kind of man who'd use both if he felt cornered." Mae knew her father was right. She'd seen the way Thompson looked at her, the barely concealed violence in his eyes, but she'd also seen the way the workers looked at her, with hope, with the desperate belief that maybe, finally, someone would stand up for them. "I'll be careful," Mae said, "but I have to do this, Da. If I don't, who will?" Patrick sighed. "You're right, of course. You're always right, damn you." He stood and pulled her into a rough embrace. "Just promise me you'll tell McAllister first thing tomorrow. Don't confront Thompson alone." "I promise." But even as she said it, Mae wondered if promises were enough. Thompson had power, connections, the weight of the company behind him. What did she have? A ledger full of numbers and a stubborn refusal to look away from injustice. Maybe that would be enough. Or maybe, she thought as she lay down to sleep, maybe she was about to learn the same lesson her mother had learned, that the world didn't reward righteousness, that standing up for what was right often meant getting knocked down. But at least she'd be standing. At least she'd be able to look at herself in the mirror and know she'd tried. Outside, the night deepened, and the mountains stood silent watch over the camp. In his tent, Thompson plotted. In the Chinese camp, Lau lay awake, his shoulder throbbing, wondering if he'd survive long enough to pay off his father's debts. And in his own tent, John McAllister stared at the ceiling and tried to calculate how many more men would die before the railway was complete. None of them knew that tomorrow would bring a reckoning. None of them knew that the mountain was about to claim another victim, and that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. The strike began at dawn, without warning or fanfare. John emerged from his tent to find the Irish and Scottish workers gathered in a loose circle near the main cook fire, their faces set with determination. Patrick O'Reilly stood at the center, his voice carrying across the camp. "We're not asking for much," Patrick was saying. "Just fair pay for fair work. We're paid $3 a day while the Chinese get $1 for the same work. That's not right, and we all know it. But more than that, we're being cheated by Thompson. Short waits on supplies, deductions for tools we never received, hours worked that never appear on the payroll." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. John saw Mae standing beside her father, her face pale but resolute. She caught his eye and gave a small nod, as if to say, "This is necessary." Thompson appeared from his tent, his face flushed with anger. "What the hell is this? Get back to work, all of you." "We're not working until we get what we're owed," Patrick said calmly. "And until the Chinese workers get fair pay too?" That surprised John. He'd expected the white workers to demand more for themselves, not to advocate for the Chinese crew, but Patrick was smarter than that. He understood that as long as the company could play workers against each other, none of them would have any power. "You're fired," Thompson snarled. "All of you. I'll bring in new workers, men who understand what loyalty means." "Go ahead," Patrick said. "But you'll not find men willing to work in these conditions for the pay you're offering. And even if you do, it'll take weeks to train them. You'll fall so far behind schedule that Van Horn will have your head." Thompson's hand moved to the pistol at his belt. For a moment, John thought the foreman might actually draw it, might shoot Patrick where he stood. But then Thompson seemed to remember where he was, that there were witnesses, that murder would be hard to explain even for a man with his connections. "McAllister," Thompson said, turning to John, "are you going to let this happen? Are you going to let these men hold the railway hostage?" John looked at the assembled workers, at their worn faces and calloused hands, at the determination in their eyes. He thought of Mae's ledgers, of the evidence of Thompson's theft that she'd shown him last night. He thought of Lau's records, of the 43 Chinese workers who died on the Fraser Canyon section, of the 2 who died here. "They're not holding the railway hostage," John said quietly. "They're asking for justice, and I think they deserve it." Thompson's face went purple. "You're siding with them? Against me?" "I'm siding with what's right." John stepped forward, positioning himself between Thompson and the workers. "Mae O'Reilly has shown me the payroll records. You've been stealing from these men, Thompson. Hundreds of dollars a month. That ends now." "You can't prove anything," Thompson said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "I can prove everything," Mae said, stepping forward. She held up the ledgers. "Every discrepancy, every false charge, every worker who doesn't exist. It's all here, in your own handwriting." Thompson's hand tightened on his pistol. "You little bitch! I warned you what would happen if you caused trouble. And I warned you what would happen if you touched her," Patrick said, his own hand moving to his knife. The tension was thick enough to cut. John could feel it, could see the way men were choosing sides, the way the camp was dividing into those who supported Thompson and those who supported the workers. It was a powder keg, and all it would take was one spark to set it off. "Everyone, calm down," John said, his voice carrying the authority of command. "Thompson, you're relieved of duty pending an investigation. Patrick, you and the other workers will get the back pay you're owed, and we'll establish fair wages for everyone, including the Chinese crew." "You don't have the authority to relieve me," Thompson said. "Only Van Horn can do that." "Then we'll send a telegram to Van Horn and let him decide." John met Thompson's eyes. "But until we hear back, you're not giving any orders. Is that clear?" For a long moment, Thompson said nothing. Then, slowly, he released his grip on the pistol. "Fine. But you're making a mistake, McAllister. A big mistake. And when Van Horn hears about this, you'll be the one looking for work." Thompson stalked off toward his tent, leaving John alone with the workers. They were watching him with a mixture of hope and suspicion, waiting to see if he'd keep his word or if this was just another empty promise from management. "I need someone to ride to the nearest telegraph office," John said. "We'll send a message to Van Horn explaining the situation and requesting his guidance. In the meantime, I want everyone back to work, but we'll do it safely, and we'll do it fairly. No more shortcuts, no more risking lives to meet arbitrary deadlines." "What about our back pay?" someone called out. "I'll calculate what's owed based on Mae's records and pay it out of the emergency fund. If the company objects, they can take it out of my salary." John looked around at the assembled workers. "I know you have no reason to trust me. I'm new here, and I'm management. But I give you my word that things will change. Starting now." Patrick stepped forward and extended his hand. "That's good enough for me, Mr. McAllister." They shook, and slowly, the tension began to ease. Men started drifting toward the work site, talking among themselves, the crisis averted for now. But John knew it was only temporary. Thompson wouldn't accept this quietly, and Van Horn might very well side with the foreman over the workers. Mae approached, the ledgers still clutched to her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing me, for standing up to Thompson." "You did the hard part," John said. "I just backed you up." "Still, it means something." Mae glanced toward Thompson's tent. "But he's not going to let this go. He'll find a way to strike back." "I know. We'll have to be careful." "Careful." Mae's laugh was bitter. "I've been careful my whole life, Mr. McAllister. Careful not to speak too loudly, not to challenge men's authority, not to step outside the narrow bounds of what's considered proper for a woman. And where has it gotten me? Nowhere. Sometimes you have to stop being careful and start being brave." She walked away before John could respond. leaving him with the uncomfortable realization that she was right. Caution had its place, but there came a point where caution became cowardice, where the fear of consequences paralyzed you into inaction. John spent the rest of the morning organizing the work crews and calculating back pay. The numbers were staggering. Thompson had stolen nearly $1,000 over the past 3 months. Some of the workers were owed weeks of wages, money that could mean the difference between their families eating or going hungry. As he worked, John kept one eye on Thompson's tent. The foreman hadn't emerged since their confrontation, and that worried John more than if he'd been ranting and raving. A quiet Thompson was a dangerous Thompson, a man plotting revenge rather than venting anger. Around noon, Lau appeared at John's tent. His arm was in a sling, his face still pale from yesterday's near-death experience, but his eyes were alert. "Mr. McAllister, may I speak with you?" "Of course. How's your shoulder?" "Painful, but healing." Lau sat down carefully. "I wanted to thank you for stopping the work yesterday. You may have saved my life. You shouldn't have been on that ledge in the first place. It was too unstable." "Yes, but I wonder—" Lau hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I wonder if it was as unstable as it seemed, or if perhaps someone made it more unstable." John felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that the ledge held firm for hours while we drilled. Then, suddenly, it collapsed. And when I examined the rock afterward, I noticed that some of the shale had been loosened deliberately. Someone had been digging at the base of the ledge, weakening it." "Are you sure?" "I am sure." Lau met John's eyes. "Someone tried to kill me, Mr. McAllister. Or, if not me specifically, then whoever happened to be standing on that ledge when it gave way." John's mind raced. Who would benefit from an accident? Who would want to discredit his safety procedures, to prove that his caution was costing lives rather than saving them? Thompson. It had to be Thompson. "Can you prove it?" John asked. "No. The evidence was destroyed when the ledge collapsed, but I know what I saw." Lau's voice was steady, certain. "And I think you should be very careful, Mr. McAllister. Thompson is a dangerous man, and you have made an enemy of him." "I'll be careful," John said, though he wondered if careful was enough. If Thompson was willing to kill to protect his schemes, then no one was safe. Not John, not Mae, not any of the workers who'd stood up to him. That evening, John sent Timothy Brennan to the nearest town with a telegram for Van Horn. It was carefully worded, explaining the situation without directly accusing Thompson of theft or attempted murder. John knew that Van Horn valued results over ethics, that the railway magnate would be more concerned with delays than with justice, but he had to try. As darkness fell, John made his rounds of the camp, checking on the workers, making sure the night watch was posted. The Chinese camp was quiet, the men exhausted from the day's labor. The Irish and Scottish workers were more animated, talking and laughing around their fires, buoyed by the promise of back pay and fair treatment. John found Mae sitting alone near the edge of camp, staring out at the mountains. She'd changed into a dress again, but she still wore her work boots, still had that air of defiance that seemed to surround her like armor. "Mind if I join you?" John asked. "It's a free country, or so they tell me." Mae didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the distant peaks. "Do you think Van Horn will support you, or will he side with Thompson?" "I don't know," John admitted. "Van Horn's a pragmatist. He'll do whatever he thinks will get the railway built fastest." "Then we're probably doomed." Mae's voice was flat, resigned. "Because Thompson's way is faster. Drive the men hard, cut corners on safety, don't worry about who dies as long as the work gets done." "Maybe. But Thompson's way also leads to strikes, to accidents, to delays caused by low morale and high turnover." John sat down beside her. "In the long run, treating workers fairly is more efficient. Van Horn's smart enough to see that." "I hope you're right." Mae finally looked at him, her eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. "But I've seen too many smart men make stupid choices because they were afraid or greedy or just didn't care. My father's worked for men like that his whole life. It's why he's 50 years old and has nothing to show for it but scars and broken bones. Is that why you're here? To make sure he's treated fairly? Partly, but also because— Mae trailed off, then seemed to make a decision. Also because I'm tired of being invisible. Tired of being told that women should stay home and keep quiet and let men handle the important things. I want to matter, Mr. McAllister. I want my life to mean something beyond cooking and cleaning and bearing children for some man who'll probably drink himself to death or get killed in an industrial accident. John heard the pain in her voice, the frustration of a sharp mind trapped in a world that had no use for sharp-minded women. You matter, he said quietly. What you did with those ledgers, standing up to Thompson, that took courage, and it's going to make a real difference for these workers. If Van Horn supports you, if Thompson doesn't find a way to destroy us first. Mae stood, brushing dirt from her dress. But thank you for saying it. Even if it's not true, it's nice to hear. She walked away, leaving John alone with the mountains and his doubts. He thought about what Lau had said, about the ledge being deliberately weakened. He thought about Thompson's rage, about the way the foreman's hand had moved to his pistol. He thought about Mae's courage and Patrick's determination and the 43 Chinese workers who died building the Fraser Canyon section. And he thought about his brother Thomas, crushed between coupling cars because someone hadn't checked the equipment properly, because speed had been valued over safety, because one man's life had been deemed less important than keeping to a schedule. John had sworn he wouldn't let it happen again. But standing here, in the shadow of these ancient mountains, with enemies on all sides and the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, he wondered if his oath had been nothing more than hubris. The mountain didn't care about his promises, the company didn't care about his conscience, and men like Thompson didn't care about anything except their own profit and power. Maybe Mae was right. Maybe they were doomed. But even if they were, John decided, they'd go down fighting. They'd stand up for what was right, even if it cost them everything. Because the alternative, to accept injustice, to look away from suffering, to value iron and steam over human lives, that was a kind of death too, a death of the soul, slower but no less certain than a fall from a cliff or a cave-in or a bullet from Thompson's gun. John stood and walked back to his tent, his mind already working on contingency plans. If Van Horn sided with Thompson, he'd resign and take his concerns to the newspapers. If Thompson tried to sabotage the work again, John would document everything and press charges. And if it came to violence, well, John had learned to fight in the rough railway camps of Scotland. He wasn't afraid of Thompson or any man. But as he lay down to sleep, John couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming, that the mountain was about to exact its price, and that all his plans and promises might not be enough to stop it. Chapter 6. The land remembers. The Katunaxa hunting party appeared 3 days later, emerging from the forest like ghosts. There were 5 of them, led by a man John would later learn was called Nalmukchin, he who speaks for the people. They were dressed in a mixture of traditional and European clothing, their faces painted for war or ceremony. John couldn't tell which. The camp fell silent as the Katunaxa approached. Men stopped working, hands moving to weapons they probably shouldn't have been carrying. John felt the tension ratchet up, felt the fear and hostility radiating from the workers. To them, Indians meant danger, meant the savage wilderness pushing back against civilization's advance. John walked forward to meet them, his hands empty and visible. "I'm John McAllister, chief engineer for this section of the railway. Do you speak English?" Nalmukchin studied him for a long moment before responding. "I speak your language. I learned it at the mission school before I understood what your schools were for." His English was perfect, his voice carrying an edge of bitter irony. "You are building your iron road through our hunting grounds." "Yes," John said. There was no point in denying it. "We're building a railway from the Pacific to the Atlantic." "We know what you are building. We have seen it on the Fraser River, seen how it tears up the land, drives away the game, poisons the water." Nalmukchin gestured at the scarred mountainside, at the blasted rock and felled trees. You come to our land without asking, without offering payment, without even acknowledging that this land belongs to anyone but yourselves. John felt the weight of the accusation. It was true, all of it. The railway company had negotiated with the Canadian government, had secured rights and permissions from distant politicians in Ottawa. But they'd never asked the people who actually lived here, who'd hunted and fished and raised their families on this land for thousands of years. "You're right," John said. "We should have asked. We should have negotiated. But I'm just an engineer. I don't make those decisions." "No, you just carry them out." Nalmukchin's voice was hard. "You just follow orders, just do your job, just build your railway. And when our people are starving because the game is gone, when our children are dying because the water is poisoned, you will say it is not your fault, that you were just following orders." Behind John, he could hear Thompson approaching, could hear the foreman's heavy footsteps and labored breathing. "Get off this site!" Thompson shouted. "This is private property. You're trespassing." "Private property." Nalmukchin's laugh was bitter. "You claim to own the land, but the land cannot be owned. It is not a thing to be bought and sold. It is alive. It has spirit. It remembers." "I don't care what it remembers," Thompson said. He'd drawn his pistol, was holding it loosely at his side. "You've got 1 minute to leave before I start shooting." "Thompson, put the gun away," John said sharply. "We're not shooting anyone." "The hell we're not. These savages need to learn that they can't just walk into our camp and make demands." Nalmukchin's hand moved to the rifle slung across his back, and suddenly the other Ktunaxa warriors were armed too, their weapons appearing with practiced ease. The camp erupted into chaos, workers scrambling for cover, shouts rising in a dozen languages. John saw Mae duck behind a supply wagon, saw Lau pull way down behind a stack of timber. The air itself seemed to crackle with violence waiting to be born. "Thompson!" John's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Stand down. That's an order." "An order?" Thompson's face was red, his eyes wild. "You don't give me orders, McAllister. I've been running this crew since before you arrived with your fancy engineering degree and your—" John moved. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and grabbed Thompson's wrist, forcing the pistol down. "I said stand down." For a moment, Thompson resisted, his muscles tensing. Then John twisted, using leverage rather than strength, and the pistol clattered to the ground. Thompson stumbled back, breathing hard, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. John turned to face Nalmukchin, his hands raised, palms out. "Please, lower your weapons. There's been enough death on this mountain." The Ktunaxa leader studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, he lowered his rifle. The other warriors followed suit, though their hands remained close to their weapons. "You speak of death," Nalmukchin said. "Do you know how many of my people have died since your railway came? Not from bullets, but from sickness, from hunger, because the buffalo no longer come, from despair, because the old ways are dying." John felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders like stones. "I know, and I'm sorry, but killing each other here won't bring them back." "No, it won't." Nalmukchin's gaze swept across the camp, taking in the workers who had emerged from cover, the faces watching from every direction. Chinese, Irish, Scottish, English, all of them united in their fear. "But perhaps it would make you understand. Perhaps if you felt what we feel, you would stop." "We can't stop," John said quietly. "The railway will be built, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But we can honor the land. We can remember, and we can try to do less harm." "Try!" Nalmukchin's voice was bitter. "Your people are always trying, but the harm is done anyway." "Aye, it is." John met his gaze steadily. "And I'll carry that knowledge with me until I die. But I'm asking you, please, give us a chance to prove we're not all like him." He gestured toward Thompson, who was still breathing hard, his face twisted with rage. Nalmukchin was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, sharply. "We will watch, And if you break the sacred places, if you poison the water or destroy the hunting grounds, we will return. And next time, there will be no talking. I understand." The Katunaxa leader turned to leave, his warriors falling in behind him. But at the edge of the camp, he paused and looked back. "You are not like the others, engineer. You have seen death. You understand loss, but understanding is not enough. You must act." Then they were gone, melting into the forest as silently as they had come. John stood there for a long moment, his heart still pounding, his hands trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. Around him, the camp slowly came back to life, workers emerging from cover, voices rising in nervous chatter, the normal sounds of construction resuming. Thompson pushed past him, his shoulder deliberately striking John's. "You made us look weak," he hissed. "You made me look weak." "I kept us alive," John said quietly. "That's all that matters." "Is it?" Thompson's laugh was harsh. "You think they'll respect us now? You think they won't come back and finish what they started?" "I think," John said, his voice hard, "that if you'd had your way, we'd all be dead, and the railway would be finished anyway, just with different men building it." He walked away before Thompson could respond, his legs unsteady, his mind reeling. Mae appeared at his side, her face pale, but her eyes fierce. "That was brave," she said quietly, "and foolish." "Aye, both, I suppose." John ran a hand through his hair. "But what else could I do? Let Thompson start a war?" "No, you did the right thing." Mae's hand found his arm, squeezed gently. "But Thompson won't forgive you for it. You humiliated him in front of everyone." "I know." John looked back toward where Thompson had disappeared into his tent. "I know." That night, John couldn't sleep. He lay in his tent, listening to the sounds of the camp, the crackle of dying fires, the murmur of voices, the distant howl of wolves in the mountains. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Thompson's pistol, saw the Katunaxa warriors raising their rifles, saw the moment when everything could have gone wrong. He'd been so close to failing, so close to letting violence erupt, to letting men die under his watch, just like before. Chapter 7. A Haunting Past. The memory came unbidden, as it always did in the dark hours before dawn. Scotland. The mine. The smell of coal dust and sweat and fear. John had been 23, newly graduated from university with his engineering degree, full of ideas about how to make the mine safer. His father had been a miner, had died in a collapse when John was 12. His mother had raised him alone, had scraped together every penny to send him to school, had believed he could make a difference. And he'd tried. God, he'd tried. He'd designed new support structures, had argued with the mine owners about ventilation and safety protocols. They'd listened, had even implemented some of his suggestions. He'd thought he was making progress. Then came the day of the explosion. Fire damp. Methane gas that had built up in a poorly ventilated shaft. One spark from a pickaxe, and the whole section had gone up. 17 men dead, including his younger brother, Thomas, who'd been working there to help support their mother. John had been on the surface when it happened, had heard the explosion, had felt the ground shake, had run down into the darkness with the rescue crews, had searched through the rubble and the smoke, had found Thomas's body crushed beneath a fallen beam. His brother's eyes had been open, staring at nothing. John had held him, had screamed until his voice gave out, had cursed God and the mine owners and himself for not doing more, for not insisting on better ventilation, for not refusing to let Thomas work there in the first place. The mine owners had called it an accident, an unfortunate tragedy. They'd paid compensation to the families, a pittance barely enough to bury the dead, and reopened the mine 2 weeks later. John had left to Scotland the next month, had taken a ship to Canada, had tried to outrun the guilt and the grief, had thought that maybe in a new land he could start over, could build something that mattered, could save lives instead of failing to protect them. But here he was, years later, still watching men die. Still making compromises with men like Thompson, still wondering if he was doing enough. A sound outside his tent made him sit up. Footsteps, light and careful. He reached for the knife he kept beside his bedroll, then relaxed as he recognized Mae's voice. "John, are you awake?" "Aye, come in." Mae ducked through the tent flap, a lantern in her hand. In its light, her face looked tired, shadows under her eyes. "I couldn't sleep either," she said. "Kept thinking about what almost happened today." "Aye." John gestured for her to sit. "It was close. Too close." Mae set the lantern down between them. "Thompson's going to try something. You know that, don't you? He won't let this go." "I know." John rubbed his face. "But what can I do? Fire him? Van Horn would just send another foreman, probably worse, and the men need their wages. If I make too many waves, the whole project could collapse." "So you do nothing?" "I didn't say that." John met her gaze. "But I have to be careful. I have to choose my battles." Mae was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "You're afraid." "Of course I'm afraid. I'm terrified." The words came out before John could stop them. "Every day, I wake up wondering if this will be the day someone else dies. If I'll make the wrong decision, if I'll miss something important, if I'll fail again." "Again?" And suddenly, John was talking, telling her about Scotland, about the mine, about Thomas, about the guilt that had followed him across an ocean, that woke him in the night, that made him question every decision he made. Mae listened without interrupting, her green eyes steady on his face. When he finished, she reached out and took his hand. "You can't save everyone," she said quietly. "No one can. But you can try. And you can make sure that when people do die, it's not because someone was cutting corners or stealing wages or putting profit over safety." "Is that enough?" "I don't know." Mae's grip tightened. "But it's more than most people do, and it's more than Thompson would ever do." John looked down at their joined hands. "Why are you here, Mae? Really? You could have stayed in Montreal, found easier work. Why come out here to the middle of nowhere?" Mae was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My mother died in a factory fire. She was a seamstress, worked 16-hour days in a building with locked doors and no fire escapes. When the fire started, she couldn't get out. None of them could." "God, Mae, I'm sorry." "The owners paid a fine. $100. That's what my mother's life was worth to them." Mae's voice was steady, but John could hear the anger beneath it. "I swore then that I'd never let anyone else's death be meaningless, that I'd fight for the people who couldn't fight for themselves. That's why I'm here. That's why I won't let Thompson get away with what he's doing." They sat in silence for a while, the lantern flickering between them. Outside, the camp was beginning to wake. The first sounds of morning, the clang of pots, the murmur of voices. Finally, Mae stood. "You're a good man, John McAllister. Don't let your past convince you otherwise." After she left, John lay back down, but he didn't try to sleep. Instead, he thought about what she'd said, about trying, about making sure deaths weren't meaningless. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could do. When dawn came, John rose and dressed and stepped out into the cold morning air. The mountains loomed above him, ancient and indifferent. The railway stretched behind him, a thin line of steel cutting through the wilderness. He thought about Thomas, about his mother, about all the men who had died building this railway, whose names would never be remembered, whose sacrifices would be forgotten. And he made a decision. He would finish this railway. He would see it through to the end, but he would do it his way, with honor, with integrity, with as little harm as possible. And if that meant standing up to Thompson, to Van Horn, to anyone who put profit over people, then so be it. He'd failed before. He'd carry that failure with him always. But he wouldn't fail again. Chapter 8. Crossing the Chasm. The gorge was a wound in the earth, a jagged slash that dropped 300 feet to a river that looked like a silver thread from above. Standing at its edge, John felt his stomach clench with familiar fear. "Christ," Patrick breathed beside him. "That's a long way down." "Aye." John studied the opposite side, calculating angles and distances. "We'll need to build a trestle bridge, temporary structure to get the rails across, Then we can reinforce it later. How long will it take? 3 weeks, maybe 4 if the weather holds. And if it doesn't? John didn't answer. They both knew what happened when weather turned bad in the mountains. Delays, accidents, deaths. Lau appeared at John's other side, Wei trailing behind him. The young man's face was still pale from the accident weeks ago, but he was walking without a limp now, his arm healed. "This is the place?" Lau asked quietly. "Aye, this is it." John turned to face the assembled workers, Chinese, Irish, Scottish, a few English, all of them looking at the gorge with varying degrees of fear and resignation. "I won't lie to you. This is the most dangerous work we've done yet. We'll be working on scaffolding over a 300-foot drop. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and you're dead." Silence. Then Thompson's voice, harsh and mocking. "Trying to scare them off, McAllister? Or just showing off your fancy education?" John ignored him. "Anyone who doesn't want to do this work, speak now. There's no shame in it. I'll find other jobs for you." No one moved. John felt something twist in his chest. Pride, maybe, or sorrow. These men had nowhere else to go. They needed the wages. They'd risk death because the alternative was starvation. "All right, then." John turned back to the gorge. "We start with the foundation posts. We'll need to anchor them in the rock on both sides, then build out the scaffolding. Lau, I want your crew on the north side. Patrick, take the south. And for God's sake, everyone, use the safety ropes. I don't care if it slows you down. I'd rather finish late than bury more men." The work began at dawn the next day. John had designed a system of ropes and pulleys to lower men down the gorge face where they would drill holes for the foundation posts. It was slow, painstaking work, and every moment felt like balanced on a knife's edge. Mae had insisted on helping, despite John's protests. She worked alongside the men, hauling rope and timber, her face set with determination. More than once, John saw workers glance at her with something like respect. On the third day, disaster nearly struck. Wei was being lowered down the north face, a drill strapped to his back, when one of the ropes began to fray. John saw it happening, saw the fibers separating, saw Wei swinging out over empty air, and his heart stopped. "Pull him up!" he shouted. "Now!" But Lau was already moving, grabbing the rope with both hands, his muscles straining as he hauled Wei back up. Other workers rushed to help, and together they dragged the young man back over the edge. Wei collapsed on solid ground, his face white, his whole body shaking. I thought I was dead." "You're all right." Lau's hands were gentle on his shoulders. "You're safe now." John examined the rope, his jaw tight. The fraying was too clean, too deliberate. Someone had cut it partway through. Thompson. He looked up and saw the foreman watching from across the gorge, a slight smile on his face. That night, John called a meeting. All the workers gathered around the fire, their faces tired and wary in the flickering light. "Someone sabotaged Wei's rope today," John said without preamble. "Someone tried to kill him." Murmurs of shock and anger rippled through the crowd. Thompson stood at the back, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "I don't know who did it," John continued, "but I'm telling you now, if it happens again, if anyone else is hurt because of sabotage, I will find out who's responsible. And I will make sure they face justice." "Justice?" Thompson's laugh was harsh. "What justice? You think Van Horn cares if a few Chinese workers die? You think anyone back east gives a damn about what happens out here?" "I care," John said quietly, "and I think most of the men here care too. We're all risking our lives to build this railway. The least we can do is not kill each other." For a moment, Thompson looked like he might argue. Then he spat into the fire and walked away. Mae appeared at John's side. "He's getting desperate," she said quietly. "That makes him dangerous." "I know." John watched Thompson disappear into the darkness. "But what can I do? I have no proof, and even if I did, Van Horn would probably just cover it up. Then we watch him. All of us." Mae raised her voice so the other workers could hear. "We look out for each other. We check our equipment. We don't let him hurt anyone else." There were nods around the fire, murmurs of agreement. Lau stood, his weathered face grave in the firelight. "In my village," he said, "we have a saying. A single thread cannot make a rope, but many threads together are unbreakable. We are many threads. If we stand together, no one can break us." "Aye," Patrick said. "The lad's right. We're stronger together than apart." John felt something shift in the air, a sense of unity, of shared purpose. These men had come from different countries, spoke different languages, worshipped different gods. But here, on this mountain, facing death together, they were becoming something more than just workers. They were becoming a community. The work on the gorge continued. Days blurred together, the screech of drills, the ring of hammers, the constant fear of falling. But, slowly, impossibly, the bridge began to take shape. Foundation posts rose from the gorge floor. Scaffolding spread like a spider's web across the chasm. Rails began to stretch across the gap. John worked alongside the men, his hands blistered, his back aching. He checked every rope, every beam, every bolt. He barely slept, haunted by nightmares of men falling, of the bridge collapsing, of failure. But there were moments of grace, too. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, John stood on the half-finished bridge with Mae and Lau. Below them, the river rushed through the gorge, its voice a constant roar. "It's beautiful," Mae said softly. "In a terrible sort of way." "Aye." John looked at the bridge stretching beneath his feet, at the mountains rising on either side. "We're building something that will last. Something that will connect people, that will bring goods and families across this wilderness. That has to count for something." "It does," Lau said, "but we must not forget what it cost. The men who died, the land that was taken, the people who were displaced." "No," John agreed, "we won't forget." They stood there in silence as darkness fell, three people from three different worlds united by the work they were doing and the sacrifices they'd witnessed. 3 weeks later, the bridge was complete. John stood at one end and watched as the first locomotive crossed, its wheels rumbling on the rails, its whistle echoing through the gorge. The workers cheered, their voices rising in triumph. But John didn't cheer. He thought about the men who had died to build this bridge, about Wei, who had nearly fallen, about all the close calls and narrow escapes. The bridge was beautiful. It was an engineering marvel. It would serve for decades, maybe centuries. But it had been built with blood and fear and suffering, and John would never forget that. Chapter 9. The Price of Progress. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the bridge was completed. They were working on a section of track that ran along a steep mountainside, blasting through rock to create a level bed for the rails. It was dangerous work, but no more dangerous than anything else they'd done. John had checked the charges himself, had made sure the fuses were properly set, had ordered everyone back to a safe distance. But someone had miscalculated, or someone had sabotaged the charges, or the rock had been more unstable than anyone realized. John would never know for certain. The explosion came without warning, a roar that shook the mountain, a blast of heat and dust and flying stone. John was thrown backward, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. When he could see again, he saw the mountainside collapsing, tons of rock sliding down in a deadly avalanche, and he saw men caught in its path. "No!" The word tore from his throat as he ran forward, stumbling over debris, his heart pounding. "No, no, no!" But it was too late. The avalanche had already swept through the work site, burying men and equipment under tons of stone. The dust was so thick John could barely breathe, could barely see. He heard screaming, heard voices calling for help, heard the terrible silence that followed. "Get shovels!" he shouted. "Everyone who can move, start digging, now!" The next hours were a nightmare. They dug through the rubble with their bare hands when the shovels weren't enough, pulled out bodies, some alive, some not. John worked until his hands bled, until his muscles screamed, until he couldn't tell the difference between sweat and tears on his face. Mae was there beside him, her dress torn and filthy, her face streaked with dust and blood. She'd found a young Irish worker, barely 18, crushed beneath a boulder. She'd held his hand as he died, had whispered prayers in Gaelic, had closed his eyes when it was over. Lau was pulling men from the rubble with methodical efficiency, his face a mask of grief. Wei was helping him, tears streaming down his face as he uncovered the body of a friend. By the time the sun set, they had recovered 11 bodies. 7 more men were injured, some critically. The work site looked like a battlefield, blood on the rocks, torn clothing, broken tools scattered everywhere. John stood in the middle of it all, his whole body shaking, his mind numb with horror. 11 men. 11 lives ended in an instant. 11 families who would receive telegrams, who would grieve, who would wonder if it had been worth it. Thompson appeared at his side, his face pale. For once, the foreman wasn't smirking or sneering. He looked genuinely shaken. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Thompson said quietly. I never meant for this many to die." John turned to look at him, and something in his expression made Thompson step back. "What did you do?" John's voice was deadly quiet. I may have adjusted some of the charges, made them a bit stronger, to speed up the work. Van Horn's been pushing for faster progress, and I thought—" John's fist caught Thompson in the jaw before the foreman could finish. Thompson went down hard, blood streaming from his split lip. "You thought—" John's voice was shaking with rage. "You thought you'd risk men's lives to impress Van Horn? You thought you'd cut corners and hope no one noticed?" Thompson scrambled backward, his eyes wide with fear. "It was an accident. I didn't know the rock was unstable." "You didn't know because you didn't check." John advanced on him, his fists clenched. "You didn't know because you were too busy stealing wages and sabotaging equipment and trying to make yourself look good." "John," Mae's hand on his arm, gentle but firm. "Don't. He's not worth it." John stopped, breathing hard. Around them, workers had gathered, their faces grim. Some of them were holding tools, shovels, pickaxes, hammers. They looked at Thompson with murder in their eyes. "Get him out of here," John said quietly. "Lock him in his tent. I'll send word to Van Horn in the morning. Let the company decide what to do with him." 2 workers grabbed Thompson and dragged him away. The foreman didn't resist, didn't protest. He looked broken, defeated. John turned to face the assembled workers. "We'll bury the dead tomorrow," he said, his voice hoarse. "With honor, with respect, and then—" He paused, struggling to find words. "And then we'll decide if we want to keep building this railway. Because I won't force anyone to stay. Not after this." That night, John sat alone in his tent, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. He didn't drink, just held it, staring at the amber liquid, thinking about how easy it would be to drown his grief and guilt in alcohol. But he didn't. Because Mae was right. He couldn't save everyone, but he could make sure their deaths weren't meaningless. A sound at the tent flap made him look up. Lau stood there, his face drawn with exhaustion and sorrow. "May I come in?" "Aye." Lau sat down across from him, moving with the careful precision of someone who was barely holding himself together. "3 of the men who died were from my village," he said quietly. "I knew their families. I promised I would look after them." "I'm sorry," John said. The words felt inadequate, hollow. "It is not your fault. You did everything you could to keep us safe." Lau's eyes met his. "But Thompson must face justice, not just for today, but for all the men who died because of his greed." "He will. I'll make sure of it." "Will you?" Lau's voice was gentle but skeptical. "Or will Van Horn protect him? Will the company pay compensation and move on, and nothing will change?" John didn't have an answer, because Lau was right. That was exactly what would probably happen. Thompson would be fired, maybe fined. The families of the dead would receive a pittance, and the railway would continue, built on the bones of men no one would remember. "I don't know," John said finally, "but I have to try." Lau nodded slowly. "Then I will help you. We all will, because if we don't stand up for the dead, who will?" Chapter 10. Unity in the face of adversity. They buried the dead on a hillside overlooking the railway, in graves marked with simple wooden crosses. The entire camp attended, Chinese workers standing beside Irish laborers, Scottish engineers beside English surveyors. Even the Katunaksa came, Nalmukchin and a dozen warriors standing at a respectful distance, their presence a silent acknowledgement of shared grief. Lao led the ceremony. He burned incense and paper offerings, chanting prayers in Cantonese that rose and fell like water over stones. Then he spoke in English, his voice carrying across the hillside. In my culture, we believe that the dead continue their journey in the next world, but they do not travel alone. They carry with them the memories of those who loved them, the honor of those who remember them. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the assembled workers. These men died building a railway. They died far from home, far from their families. But they did not die alone. They died among brothers, and we will remember them. Patrick stepped forward next, his weathered face wet with tears. I didn't know all these lads, he said, his voice rough, but I knew enough of them to know they were good men, hard workers, brave souls who came to this wild land looking for a better life. He paused, struggling for words. They deserved better than this. They deserved to go home to their families, to grow old, to see their children grow, but they're gone now, and all we can do is make sure their sacrifice meant something. Mae spoke last. She stood at the edge of the graves, her red hair bright in the morning sun, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. My mother used to say that the measure of a person's life isn't how they died, but how they lived. These men lived with courage. They faced danger every day, knowing they might not survive, but they did it anyway. They did it for their families. They did it for each other. They did it because they believed in something bigger than themselves. She looked out at the assembled workers. We honor them by continuing their work, by standing together, by refusing to let their deaths be meaningless. John couldn't speak. He stood at the back of the crowd, his throat tight, his eyes burning. He thought about Thomas, about his mother, about all the people he'd failed to save, about the weight of responsibility that never got lighter, only heavier. After the ceremony, the workers dispersed slowly, reluctant to return to the work that had killed their friends. John stood alone among the graves, reading the names carved into the wooden crosses. Chen Wei Lin, age 24, Patrick O'Brien, age 19, James McLeod, age 31, Huang Jian, age 28, on and on, 11 names, 11 lives cut short. They will not be forgotten. John turned to find Nalmukchin standing beside him. The Katunaksa leader's face was grave, his eyes on the graves. My people have lost many to this railway, Nalmukchin continued. Not just from violence, but from sickness, from hunger, from the destruction of our way of life. We understand grief. We understand the cost of progress. I'm sorry, John said quietly. For all of it. For the land we've taken. For the damage we've done. I know it's not enough, but no, it is not enough. Nalmukchin's voice was hard. But it is more than most of your people offer. You see us. You acknowledge our loss. That is something. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Nalmukchin said, The man who caused this, Thompson, what will happen to him? I don't know. I've sent word to Van Horn, but John trailed off, his jaw tight. The company protects its own. He'll probably be fired, maybe fined, but he won't face real justice. Then you must make your own justice. John looked at him sharply. What do you mean? I mean that sometimes the law is not enough. Sometimes a man must stand up and do what is right, even if it costs him everything. Nalmukchin's eyes met his. You are not like the others, engineer. You have honor. Use it. Then he was gone, melting back into the forest with his warriors. That evening, the workers gathered around the fire. No one spoke at first. They just sat in silence, staring into the flames, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Wei stood. His face was young, but his eyes looked old. haunted by what he'd seen. "I want to finish the railway," he said quietly. "Not for the company. Not for Van Horn or Thompson or anyone else, but for the men who died. So their sacrifice means something." "Aye," Patrick said. "The lad's right. We can't bring them back, but we can finish what they started." One by one, the other workers nodded. Chinese laborers, Irish immigrants, Scottish engineers, all of them united in their grief and their determination. Mae looked at John. "What do you say, engineer? Do we finish this?" John thought about Thomas, about his mother, about all the men buried on the hillside, about the weight of responsibility and the burden of guilt, and he thought about what Nalmukton had said, about honor, about doing what was right, even if it cost everything. "Aye," he said finally, "we finish it, but we do it right. No more cutting corners, no more risking lives for speed. We build this railway with honor, or we don't build it at all." "And Thompson?" Lau asked quietly. John's jaw tightened. "Thompson faces justice. Real justice. I'll make sure of it." The next morning, John went to Thompson's tent. The foreman was sitting on his cot, his face bruised from John's punch, his eyes hollow. "Van Horn's response came," John said, holding up a telegram. "You're fired. Effective immediately. You're to leave camp within the hour." Thompson laughed bitterly. "That's it? I kill 11 men and I just get fired?" "No." John's voice was cold. "You're also being charged with criminal negligence. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police will be here tomorrow to take you into custody. You'll stand trial in Calgary." Thompson's face went white. "You can't do that. Van Horn will never allow it. Van Horn doesn't have a choice. I've already sent statements from 24 witnesses. I've documented every corner you cut, every safety violation, every act of sabotage." John leaned forward. "You're going to prison, Thompson, and you're going to spend every day there thinking about the men you killed." For a moment, Thompson looked like he might argue. Then his shoulders slumped and he looked away. "I never meant for it to happen," he said quietly. I just wanted to prove myself, to show Van Horn I could get the job done faster, better than anyone else. And 11 men died because of your ambition." John's voice was hard. "That's something you'll have to live with." He turned to leave, then paused at the tent flap. "For what it's worth, Thompson, I don't think you're evil. I think you're weak, and in a place like this, weakness kills." Thompson didn't respond. John left him there, sitting alone in his tent, waiting for the police to arrive. That night, John stood at the edge of camp, looking out at the railway stretching into the distance. Mae appeared beside him, her hand finding his. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "Did I? Thompson's going to prison, but it won't bring those men back. It won't ease their family's grief. No, but it sends a message. It says that lives matter, that you can't just sacrifice people for profit and get away with it." Mae squeezed his hand. "That's worth something." John hoped she was right. He hoped that Thompson's trial would make a difference, would force the company to take safety more seriously, would prevent future deaths. But he knew, deep down, that it probably wouldn't. The railway would be built, and men would keep dying, and the world would keep turning. All he could do was try to make it a little better, a little more just, and hope that was enough. Chapter 11. The Last Mile. The final stretch of railway ran through a valley between two mountains, a natural corridor that would connect the eastern and western sections of the line. It was beautiful country, pine forests and clear streams, meadows full of wildflowers, the air so clean it hurt to breathe. But it was also brutal work. The ground was rocky, requiring constant blasting. The weather turned cold as autumn approached, bringing early snow that made every task twice as difficult. And the workers were exhausted, worn down by months of labor and grief. But they kept going. John worked alongside them, his hands blistered and bleeding, his back aching with every movement. He checked every charge, every rail, every bolt. He barely slept, haunted by nightmares of the accident, of men buried under rock, of Thompson's hollow eyes. But he kept going. Mae was everywhere at once, organizing supplies, tending to injured workers, keeping the books, making sure everyone was fed and paid fairly. She'd lost weight, her face gaunt with exhaustion, but her eyes were still fierce, still determined, and she kept going. Lau led his crew with quiet dignity, his presence a steadying force. He'd aged in the months since the accident, his hair now more gray than black, his movements slower, but his wisdom was undiminished, his compassion boundless, and he kept going. Wei had become a leader among the Chinese workers, his youth and energy inspiring others. He'd learned English, had started teaching it to his fellow laborers. He talked about the future, about bringing his family to Canada, about building a life in this new land. And he kept going. They all kept going, because what else could they do? The railway was almost complete. The end was in sight. To stop now would make all the suffering, all the deaths, meaningless. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, John stood with Mae and Lau on a ridge overlooking the valley. Below them, the railway stretched like a silver thread, connecting east to west, past to future. "We're almost there," Mae said softly. "Another week, maybe 2. "Aye." John felt a strange mixture of pride and sorrow. "We've built something remarkable, something that will last for generations." "But at what cost?" Lau's voice was quiet. "How many men died to build this railway? How many families were destroyed? How much land was taken from the people who lived here first?" "Too many," John said. "Too much." They stood in silence, watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple. "Do you think it was worth it?" Mae asked. "All the suffering, all the death? Do you think the railway justifies it?" John thought about Thomas, about the 11 men buried on the hillside, about Naumukchin and his people watching their way of life disappear, about all the workers who would carry scars, physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives. "No," he said finally, "I don't think anything justifies that much suffering, but—" He paused, searching for words. "But maybe we can make it mean something. Maybe we can use this railway to build a better country, a more just country, a country where people like us, immigrants, workers, the marginalized, have a voice." "That's a nice dream," Lau said, "but dreams are easy. Making them real is hard." "Aye, but we have to try." John looked at his friends, this Irish woman and this Chinese man, both of them so far from home, both of them fighting for something better. We have to try. Or, what was it all for? The final week was a blur of activity. Rails were laid, spikes were driven, ties were secured. The workers moved with mechanical efficiency, their bodies exhausted, but their spirits lifted by the knowledge that the end was near. On the last day, John stood at the final gap in the railway, a 20-foot section that would connect the eastern and western lines. The entire camp had gathered to watch, workers from every background standing shoulder to shoulder. Van Horn was there too, having arrived by train from the east. He stood apart from the workers, his expensive suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to their worn clothing and muddy boots. "Gentlemen," Van Horn said, his voice carrying across the crowd, "today we complete the Canadian Pacific Railway. Today we unite a nation. Today we prove that nothing is impossible when men work together toward a common goal." John felt Mae stiffen beside him. He knew what she was thinking, that Van Horn's speech ignored the suffering, the deaths, the exploitation, that it painted the railway as a triumph when it was also a tragedy. But he said nothing, because Van Horn was right about one thing. They had built something impossible. They had connected a continent. They had created something that would last, even if the cost had been too high. The final spike was driven by a Chinese worker. Lau had insisted on it, and Van Horn had reluctantly agreed. Wei stepped forward, a hammer in his hands, his face solemn. He raised the hammer and brought it down. Once, twice, 3 times. The spike sank into the wood, and the railway was complete. For a moment there was silence. Then the workers erupted in cheers, their voices rising in a dozen languages, their faces alight with joy and relief and exhaustion. John didn't cheer. He stood quietly, his eyes on the completed railway, thinking about all the men who weren't there to see it, about Thomas, about the 11 buried on the hillside, about all the nameless workers whose sacrifices had made this moment possible. Mae's hand found his. "We did it," she said softly. "Aye, we did." But as the celebration continued around them, John felt no triumph, only a deep, bone-weary sadness. They had built a railway, they had connected a nation, but the cost had been measured in blood and tears and broken bodies, and John would carry that knowledge with him for the rest of his life. Chapter 12. A Nation Forged in Blood. The celebration lasted 3 days. Van Horn brought in champagne and fine food, gave speeches about progress and destiny and the bright future of Canada. Photographers came to document the moment, their cameras capturing images that would appear in newspapers across the country. But John noticed who wasn't in those photographs. The Chinese workers who had done the most dangerous work, who had died in the greatest numbers, were kept to the background, their faces barely visible. The Irish laborers, the Scottish engineers, the indigenous peoples whose land had been taken, all of them were footnotes in Van Horn's grand narrative. On the 4th day, after Van Horn and the photographers had left, John stood alone at the railway's completion point. The camp was being dismantled around him, workers packing up their belongings, preparing to move on to the next job, the next railway, the next impossible task. Lau approached, Wei at his side. The older man looked tired but peaceful, as if a great burden had been lifted. "We are leaving tomorrow," Lau said. "Going to Vancouver. Wei wants to open a shop and I am too old for this work." "You've earned your rest," John said. "Both of you." "Perhaps." Lau smiled faintly. "But I think rest is not something men like us ever truly find. We carry our work with us, in our bones, in our memories." "Aye, that we do." Wei stepped forward, his young face serious. "Mr. McAllister, I want to thank you for treating us with respect, for fighting for us when no one else would, for remembering the men who died." John felt his throat tighten. "I didn't do enough. I should have." "You did what you could," Lau interrupted gently. "That is all anyone can do, and it was more than most." He held out his hand. "Goodbye, John McAllister. May your path be smooth, and may you find peace." John shook his hand, then Wei's. He watched them walk away, 2 figures disappearing into the crowd of departing workers, and felt a profound sense of loss. Mae found him an hour later, sitting on a stack of timber, staring at the completed railway. "Patrick's leaving too," she said, sitting beside him. "Going back to Montreal. Says he's too old for this life." "And you?" John asked. "What will you do?" Mae was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. Part of me wants to go back east, to fight for workers' rights in the factories and mills. But part of me—" She trailed off, looking at the mountains. "Part of me wants to stay here, to see what this country becomes, to make sure the railway is used for good, not just profit." "That's a tall order." "Aye, but someone has to try." She looked at him. "What about you? Will you stay with the railway?" John thought about it. He could stay, could continue working for the Canadian Pacific, could build more railways, more bridges, more monuments to progress. He was good at it. It was what he'd trained for, what he'd dedicated his life to. But he thought about the men buried on the hillside, about Thompson, now awaiting trial in Calgary, about Nalmukshan and his people watching their world change forever. "No," he said finally. "I'm done with railways. I'm done with building things that cost so much in human suffering." "Then what will you do?" "I don't know. Maybe I'll become a teacher, pass on what I've learned, but also teach about the cost. Make sure the next generation of engineers understands that progress isn't just about steel and stone, it's about people." He paused. "Or maybe I'll just disappear into the wilderness, find a quiet place where I can forget." "You won't forget," Mae said softly. "None of us will. This railway is written in our bones now. We'll carry it with us wherever we go." "Aye, I suppose we will." They sat in silence as the sun set, watching the last workers pack up and leave. The camp that had been home to thousands was now almost empty, just a few tents and piles of equipment remaining. "Do you think it was worth it?" Mae asked again. "All of this?" John looked at the railway stretching into the distance, at the mountains rising on either side, at the wilderness that had been tamed, or at least that men had tried to tame. "I think," he said slowly, "that worth is the wrong question. The railway exists now. It will connect people, transport goods, help build a nation. That's real. That matters. But it was built on the backs of men who had no choice. It was built by taking land from people who had lived here for thousands of years. It was built with blood and suffering and death." He paused. "So maybe the question isn't whether it was worth it. Maybe the question is, what do we do now? How do we honor the people who paid the price? How do we make sure their sacrifice means something?" Mae nodded slowly. "By remembering. By telling their stories. By fighting to make sure the next great project doesn't cost so much in human suffering. Aye, by remembering." A week later, John stood on the hillside where the 11 men were buried. He'd come alone, wanting a moment of quiet before he left this place forever. The wooden crosses were already weathering, the names carved into them fading. In a few years, they'd be illegible. In a few decades, they'd be gone entirely, rotted away, forgotten. But John would remember. He'd carry these names with him, along with Thomas's name, along with all the others who had died under his watch. He knelt and placed a stone on each grave, a tradition Lau had taught him, a way of saying, "I was here. I remember. You are not forgotten." As he stood to leave, he saw a figure watching from the edge of the forest. Nalmukjin stepped forward, his weathered face grave. "You are leaving," the Ktunaxa leader said. It wasn't a question. "Aye, there's nothing left for me here. The railway remains, your monument to progress. It's not my monument. I was just a tool, like all the others." John looked at the graves. "These men, they're the real monument. They're what I'll remember." Nalmukjin was silent for a moment. Then he said, "My people have a tradition. When someone dies, we speak their name to the wind, so the spirits will remember them. Will you do this for your dead?" John nodded. He turned to face the wind, feeling it cold against his face, and spoke the names. Chen Wei Lin, Patrick O'Brien, James McLeod, Huang Jian. On and on, 11 names spoken to the wind and the mountains and the vast, indifferent sky. When he finished, Nalmukjin nodded. "They will be remembered. Not by your history books, perhaps, not by your monuments and your speeches, but by the land, by the wind, by those of us who were here. Thank you. Do not thank me. Just remember what you have learned here. Remember that progress has a cost, and make sure in your next life that you do not forget." Then he was gone, melting back into the forest like a ghost. John stood alone on the hillside for a long time, looking at the graves, at the railway in the distance, at the mountains rising eternal and indifferent. He thought about Thomas, about his mother, about all the people he'd failed to save, and he thought about Mae's question. Was it worth it? He still didn't have an answer. Maybe there was no answer. Maybe some questions were meant to remain unanswered, to haunt you, to remind you that the world was more complicated than simple narratives of progress and triumph. But he knew one thing. He would remember. He would carry these stories with him. He would make sure that the men who died building this railway were not forgotten, that their sacrifices were not erased from history. It was the least he could do, the only thing he could do. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, John McAllister turned and walked away from the railway he had helped build. He didn't look back. Behind him, the Canadian Pacific Railway stretched across the wilderness, a thin line of steel connecting east to west, past to future. It was a marvel of engineering, a triumph of human will over nature. But it was also a monument to suffering, a reminder that progress always has a cost, and that cost is measured in blood. Epilogue. 20 years later, John McAllister stood on a platform in Vancouver watching a train pull into the station. He was older now, his hair gray, his face lined with age and experience. He'd become a teacher, as he'd planned, spending his days educating young engineers about the technical aspects of their profession and about the human cost of their work. Mae O'Reilly stood beside him, her red hair now streaked with silver, her green eyes still fierce. She'd become a labor organizer, fighting for workers' rights across Canada. She'd never married, had never settled down. The fight was her life. They'd stayed in touch over the years, meeting occasionally to remember, to share stories, to honor the dead. "Do you ever regret it?" Mae asked quietly. "Building the railway?" John thought about it. He thought about the men buried on the hillside, about Thompson rotting in prison, about Nalmukshan and his people pushed further and further from their ancestral lands. "Every day," he said. "But I also know that if I hadn't been there, someone else would have built it. Someone who cared less about the workers, who cut more corners, who let more men die. So you did make a difference. A small one, maybe." John watched the train pull away, heading east, carrying passengers and goods across the country. "But it wasn't enough. It's never enough." Mae took his hand. "No, but it's something, and sometimes something is all we can manage." They stood together on the platform, two old friends united by memory and grief and the knowledge that they had witnessed something terrible and magnificent. The railway had been built, a nation had been forged, but the cost had been measured in blood, and they would never forget.